I remember the sound first. Crystal touching crystal. The entire rooftop restaurant glittered under soft golden lights, and every powerful name in tech seemed to be gathered around the long table celebrating Sebastian Vale's latest victory. $4 billion. That was the number everyone kept repeating. Sebastian stood at the center of it all, tall, composed, untouchable, accepting congratulations like a man who believed the world was built to orbit him. Clara Whitmore sat beside him, smiling politely while cameras flashed. From the outside, they looked perfect. Inside, something felt wrong. I felt it the moment he avoided my eyes. Sebastian's hand rested casually on the table, but not once did it reach for mine. Negues toasted our unbreakable partnership. Yet his attention drifted constantly toward his business partner Dominic Reed, who sat across from them with a smile that looked too satisfied. Clara watched the exchange. A glance, then another. It lasted less than a second, but it carried a quiet agreement between the two men. Sebastian raised his glass again. To the future of Vale Technologies. Everyone applauded, but Clara noticed something else. Beside Sebastian's chair, his leather briefcase leaned against the table leg, slightly open, a stack of documents barely visible inside. She tried not to look, but curiosity won. Just one glance. 3 words jumped out. Divorce filing. Immediate. My chest tightened. The room kept celebrating, but the sound suddenly felt distant. Sebastian wasn't celebrating our future. He was ending it. Clara inhaled slowly, then she smiled again. Across the table, Dominic Reed lifted his glass toward Sebastian, a silent toast that lasted a moment too long. And for the first time that night, Clara realized something terrifying. The celebration wasn't for the merger. It was for the divorce. The orchestra played softly in the background as Sebastian leaned toward Dominic and whispered something Clara couldn't hear. Dominic chuckled quietly. Clara stared at the champagne in her glass. My marriage just ended, and no one knew yet. Clara lifted her glass again and smiled for the cameras. Clara kept smiling. That was the first rule of survival in rooms like this. Never let them see you react. Sebastian continued greeting investors who approached their table one by one, shaking hands and accepting praise for the merger that had just reshaped the tech industry. Vale Technologies had just absorbed its largest competitor. $4 billion. One historic deal. And Sebastian looked unstoppable. But Clara's eyes kept drifting toward the briefcase beside his chair. Divorce filing. Immediate. The word immediate repeated in her mind like a quiet alarm. She leaned slightly toward him. Congratulations, she said softly. Sebastian nodded without looking at her. Thank you. 2 words. Cold ones. A few seconds passed before Dominic Reed joined them at the table again, sliding into his chair with the confidence of a man who believed the night belonged to him. Dominic raised an eyebrow toward Sebastian. All set? He asked quietly. Sebastian gave a subtle nod. Clara caught it. The exchange was quick, but it carried meaning. Something had already been decided. Dominic turned toward Clara, smiling with practiced charm. You must be proud tonight, he said. Clara met his gaze. I always am. For a moment, Dominic studied her, as if trying to measure something invisible. Then he laughed lightly. Sebastian stood suddenly. Excuse me, he said, pulling his phone from his pocket. He stepped away from the table toward the edge of the rooftop, answering the call in a low voice. The briefcase remained beside his chair, unattended. Clara stared at it. I shouldn't, but I had to know. She leaned slightly down, adjusting the strap of her heel as if fixing her shoe. Her hand brushed the edge of the briefcase, just enough to open it wider. Inside were several documents neatly organized. Legal forms, asset divisions, law firm letterhead, and one page placed carefully on top. Sebastian Vale versus Clara Whitmore, the official filing. Clara's stomach tightened. This wasn't a possibility. It was already happening. Behind her, Dominic's voice broke the silence. Everything all right? Clara looked up quickly. Dominic was watching her, not casually, closely. Her fingers slipped away from the briefcase. She straightened. Of course, she replied calmly. Dominic leaned back in his chair, but his smile faded slightly, because for a split second, he thought he'd been caught. Across the rooftop, and Sebastian finished his call and began walking back toward the table. Sebastian returned with the confidence of a man who believed everything was under control. He sat down beside Clara and casually closed the briefcase with his foot, sliding it further under the table. Too late. Clara already knew. "Everything okay?" she asked. Sebastian poured himself more champagne. "Business call." Simple answer. No explanation. Dominic watched them both carefully. Clara noticed something else now, the way Dominic kept checking his watch, as if waiting for something specific to happen. The night was following a schedule. Sebastian turned to the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a relaxed smile. A few guests leaned closer, but Sebastian didn't continue yet. Instead, he looked at Clara briefly, just one glance, and for the first time in years, she saw something unfamiliar in his eyes. Distance. I used to know him. Now I don't. The music from the orchestra floated across the rooftop while waiters served another round of champagne. Isabella Whitmore sat 3 seats away, watching her sister carefully. She had noticed it too, the silence between Clara and Sebastian. Isabella leaned toward her sister. "You look pale," she whispered. "I'm fine." Clara kept her voice steady, but Isabella didn't believe it. She followed Clara's gaze toward Sebastian's briefcase under the table. "Did something happen?" Isabella asked quietly. Clara hesitated. "Just a second." Then she smiled. "Not tonight." Across the table, Dominic leaned closer to Sebastian. "Ready when you are," he murmured. Sebastian nodded slowly. The moment had arrived. Clara noticed something else then. Dominic's phone vibrated. He checked the screen quickly and smiled. That smile wasn't about the merger. It was about something else, something bigger. Clara felt a quiet realization settle in her mind. The divorce wasn't the real plan tonight. It was just part of it. Sebastian lifted his champagne glass again and tapped it gently. The room began to quiet. The announcement was coming. The rooftop slowly fell silent. Every conversation faded as Sebastian Vale stood from his chair, champagne glass raised slightly under the warm lights above the table. This was his stage, and everyone knew it. He waited a moment before speaking, allowing the silence to grow heavier, the way powerful people often did when they wanted every eye in the room fixed on them. "Tonight," Sebastian began calmly, "marks a turning point." Several guests nodded immediately. They expected a speech about the merger, a celebration, but Clara felt something colder in his tone. Sebastian looked around the table slowly. "The Vale Technologies merger is more than a business victory." Applause started again. Sebastian raised a hand. The applause stopped. He continued. It's also the beginning of a personal transition." Clara felt Isabella stiffen beside her. Dominic leaned back in his chair, arms crossed comfortably. He already knew what was coming. Sebastian finally looked at Clara and held her gaze. "I saw it coming. Still, it hurt." "For many years," Sebastian said evenly, "Clara and I have built a life together that people admire." The guests listened carefully. "But sometimes success forces us to move forward in different directions." A few people exchanged confused looks. Sebastian inhaled slowly, then said it. "Tonight I have officially filed for divorce." The words landed like glass shattering. Silence spread across the rooftop. Someone dropped a fork. Another guest gasped quietly. Isabella stood halfway out of her chair. "What?" Sebastian remained calm. Coldly calm. "As of this evening," he continued, "Clara and I will be separating legally." All eyes turned to Clara. They expected tears, shock, anger, something dramatic. Instead, Clara slowly lifted her glass, took a small sip, and placed it back on the table. Dominic frowned slightly. That wasn't the reaction anyone expected. Sebastian noticed too. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Clara rose to her feet. The entire rooftop watched her. I should feel broken, but I didn't, because the truth was, Sebastian had no idea what was about to happen next. Clara turned calmly toward him. "Congratulations on the merger," she said softly. The room remained silent. Sebastian narrowed his eyes slightly. Then Clara added something unexpected. "Before we finalize anything," she reached for her clutch purse. "Edu and I have something for you," and placed a sealed envelope gently on the table in front of him. Sebastian looked down at it, then back at her. The guests leaned closer, because suddenly, the celebration dinner felt like the beginning of a war. The envelope sat between them, unopened, heavy with silence. Sebastian stared at it for a moment longer than anyone expected, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, as if he was deciding whether the contents mattered at all. The room waited. Clara stood still, hands folded calmly in front of her. Across the table, Dominic Reed leaned slightly forward. His smile faded. "What's this supposed to be?" Sebastian asked quietly. Clara tilted her head. "Something important." A few guests exchanged nervous glances. This dinner had already taken a turn none of them expected, and now the tension in the air felt thick enough to choke on. Sebastian tapped the envelope with one finger. "You're making a scene." Clara gave a small shrug. "You started it." A faint murmur rippled around the table. Sebastian didn't like that. Powerful men rarely enjoyed losing control of the room they dominated. He picked up the envelope slowly, turning it in his hands. Dominic shifted in his chair. Clara noticed. That movement was tiny, but it mattered, because Dominic looked nervous. "Why?" Sebastian slid a finger under the seal. Tore it open. Inside were several neatly folded documents. He pulled the first page out. His confident expression froze. Just slightly. Then he read further. The second page. The third. Dominic's eyes narrowed across the table. "What is it?" one investor asked quietly. Sebastian didn't answer. His jaw tightened. Clara watched him carefully. For the first time tonight, the most powerful man in the room looked uncertain. Sebastian lowered the pages slowly and looked directly at Dominic. "What is this?" he asked, and Dominic blinked. "Excuse me?" Sebastian raised one document. The signature line was visible. Dominic Reed. The entire table leaned closer. Clara spoke calmly. "I thought you'd want to see that before finalizing our divorce." The silence deepened, because whatever Sebastian had just read, it wasn't what he expected, and Dominic knew it. Dominic leaned forward slowly. "What exactly are you implying, Clara?" His voice sounded controlled, too controlled. Sebastian's eyes remained locked on the documents in his hand, scanning the numbers again, as if hoping they would rearrange themselves into something less disturbing. They didn't. Clara spoke gently. "I'm not implying anything." She gestured toward the pages. "I'm showing him." Sebastian flipped to another sheet. Bank transfers, account numbers, shell corporations, millions moving quietly through financial channels connected to Vale Technologies. But one name appeared repeatedly, Dominic Reed. Sebastian's grip tightened on the paper. "That's impossible." Dominic scoffed. "This is ridiculous." Clara finally sat down again, crossing one leg calmly. The guests were barely breathing now. Dominic laughed lightly. "Sebastian, you can't actually believe this." Sebastian didn't respond. Instead, he flipped to the final document, a digital authorization record, executive approval stamp, signed by Dominic. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sebastian slowly raised his head. "Explain this." Dominic's smile disappeared. "That's fabricated." Clara shook her head. "It isn't." Dominic leaned forward aggressively. "You're accusing me of fraud?" Clara looked at him quietly. "I'm not accusing you." Another pause. "I'm proving it." The room stirred with whispers. One of the investors pulled out his phone. Dominic noticed, and suddenly his confidence cracked, because he understood something dangerous. This conversation was no longer private. Sebastian looked at Clara again. His voice dropped. "How long have you had this?" Clara met his gaze. "Long enough." Dominic's eyes flicked toward the surrounding guests. Phones were appearing now. People were recording. This wasn't just a dinner anymore. It was a public collapse waiting to happen. Dominic leaned back slowly. "You're bluffing." Clara's expression didn't change. "No." And then she added quietly, "You're already exposed." Dominic felt it then. The room had turned against him. Sebastian pushed his chair back slightly. The sound scraped sharply against the marble floor. Everyone jumped. He looked at Dominic again. "This says you approve the offshore transfers." Dominic spread his hands. "That document is fake." Sebastian slammed the page down on the table. "Your signature is right there." Dominic leaned closer, lowering his voice. You're really going to trust your wife over your partner? The words hung in the air. Clara watched Sebastian carefully. That sentence wasn't about truth. It was about loyalty. Sebastian hesitated. For a moment, the old pattern returned, the one where he dismissed Clara. But something was different tonight. The numbers in those documents were real. Millions. Sebastian looked at Clara again. When did you get involved in this? Clara exhaled slowly. Months ago, Dominic laughed sharply. Right, because suddenly Clara Whitmore became a forensic accountant. Clara's eyes met his. No. Another pause. I hired one. A ripple of surprise moved through the table. Sebastian frowned. You investigated my company? Clara nodded. I investigated the truth. Dominic leaned forward again, voice tightening. You had no right. Clara gave a quiet smile. Actually, I did. She tapped the edge of the table lightly. I'm still your wife. Dominic's face darkened. Sebastian looked between them, then down at the documents again. A detail caught his attention. One transaction date, 2 weeks before the merger announcement. Sebastian's eyes widened slightly, because that transfer lined up perfectly with the first stage of the deal Dominic had orchestrated. And Sebastian looked up slowly. You moved money during merger negotiations. Dominic didn't answer. That silence said everything. The investors around the table began whispering louder now. Sebastian's billion-dollar celebration was turning into something else entirely. A scandal. Clara leaned back in her chair, calm, patient. Dominic finally spoke again. You think this is enough to ruin me? Clara's voice stayed steady. No. Another pause. This is just the beginning. Dominic felt something cold run down his spine, because Clara Whitmore suddenly looked like the most dangerous person in the room. The orchestra stopped playing. No one had told them to stop, but the tension in the air had become impossible to ignore. Sebastian leaned closer to Clara. You investigated my partner behind my back. Clara nodded. Yes. His voice hardened. Why didn't you come to me? Clara held his gaze. I tried. That answer landed harder than anything else tonight. Sebastian frowned. When? Clara's expression didn't soften. 3 months ago. She leaned forward slightly. You were too busy explaining why I shouldn't worry about business decisions. Sebastian remembered that conversation. Barely. He had dismissed her concerns in less than 2 minutes. At the time, it felt insignificant. Now it felt like a mistake. Dominic seized the moment. You see what she's doing? He said quickly. She's trying to turn you against me. Sebastian didn't look at him. His attention remained on Clara. What exactly did you find? Clara reached into her purse and placed another document on the table. Sebastian picked it up, a financial trail diagram, multiple shell companies. Every line led back to Dominic. Sebastian's stomach tightened. Dominic stood abruptly. This is absurd. Several guests flinched. Dominic pointed toward Clara. You think a few spreadsheets prove anything? Clara remained calm. They're not spreadsheets. Dominic hesitated. Clara finished the sentence quietly. They're evidence. Another investor's phone buzzed loudly on the table, then another, and another. Notifications, news alerts. Everyone started checking their screens. Dominic felt his pulse spike, because the timing felt wrong. Too perfect. Clara watched the reactions around the table. Sebastian noticed it too. Clara, he said slowly, what did you do? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the glowing skyline beyond the rooftop, then back at him. I made sure the truth arrived on time. Sebastian felt a cold realization creeping into his chest. This night wasn't falling apart by accident. Clara had planned it, every second. Phones kept buzzing. The sound spread across the table like distant thunder. Investors stared down at their screens. One of them whispered something under his breath. Another stood up slowly. Sebastian grabbed the nearest phone from the table. His own notification had just appeared. A headline. Bold. Impossible to ignore. Breaking. Billion-dollar fraud investigation at Vale Technologies. Sebastian's eyes widened. He opened the article quickly. The author's name appeared at the top. Lucas Grant. Dominic swore under his breath. That's impossible. Guests were already reading aloud fragments of the report. Offshore accounts. Executive partner Dominic Reed. Financial manipulation linked to merger. The rooftop erupted into stunned conversation. Sebastian looked up from the screen. His voice dropped dangerously low. You leaked this. Clara shook her head slightly. No. Another pause. I revealed it. Dominic stepped back from the table. His confidence had vanished completely. You set me up. Clara finally stood again. No, Dominic. Her eyes were steady. You set yourself up. Across the rooftop entrance, two figures stepped out of the elevator. Dark suits, serious faces, not guests. Sebastian noticed them first. Authorities. Dominic followed his gaze and froze, because the celebration dinner had just become a crime scene. Clara watched the panic ripple across Dominic's face. Then she looked back at Sebastian. For the first time all night, he looked lost, and the empire he had built suddenly felt fragile. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet, metallic whisper. Two investigators stepped onto the rooftop. Dark suits, calm faces, no smiles. For a brief second, no one moved. The dinner that had started as a billionaire's celebration now felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Dominic Reed saw them first. His breath caught. That's not necessary, he muttered under his breath, though no one had accused him out loud yet. Clara noticed the reaction. Interesting, because innocent men rarely panic before the questions begin. Sebastian stood slowly from his chair, the article still glowing on the phone in his hand. Lucas Grant's investigation was already spreading across financial networks. The headline alone carried enough weight to shake investors, and the article underneath described millions disappearing through corporate channels that pointed directly toward Dominic's approvals. Sebastian looked up, then at Dominic. You told me everything was clean. Dominic forced a laugh. It is. But his voice cracked. The investigators approached the table calmly, their presence cutting through the crowd of wealthy guests like a blade through silk. One of them spoke. Mr. Reed? Dominic straightened immediately. Yes? We need to ask you a few questions regarding financial activity linked to Vale Technologies. A ripple of whispers spread through the investors. Sebastian looked between Dominic and Clara. Something was shifting inside him. I should have seen this. He remembered the document Clara had shown him earlier. The signatures, the transfers, the timeline. And Dominic turned toward Sebastian quickly. You're not buying into this circus, are you? Sebastian didn't answer immediately. He looked at Clara again. She stood quietly beside the table, watching everything unfold without raising her voice once. The investigators waited patiently. Dominic felt the room turning. He tried again. This is clearly a misunderstanding. One investigator nodded. Then you won't mind clarifying a few things? Dominic's smile collapsed. Clara observed the moment carefully, because something subtle had just changed. Sebastian was no longer defending Dominic, and Dominic knew it. Across the rooftop, Isabella whispered to a nearby guest. This is unbelievable. Clara heard her sister's voice but didn't turn. Her focus stayed on Sebastian, because now he was staring at her with a question that had nothing to do with business. It was personal. How long, he asked quietly, have you been planning this? Clara met his gaze. Long enough, and the silence between them said more than words ever could. At this point in the story, take a quick moment and subscribe if you're enjoying it. Stories like this take time to craft, and your support helps keep them coming. Sebastian lowered the phone slowly. The empire he had celebrated an hour ago was already cracking, and Clara Whitmore had just pulled the first brick loose. Dominic stepped away from the table. Just one step, but it felt like retreat. I'm sure this can be resolved privately, he said quickly. The investigators didn't move. We prefer transparency, one replied. Several investors quietly backed away, creating distance between themselves and Dominic. Reputation moved fast in rooms like this, and tonight Dominic's reputation was sinking. Sebastian watched it happen in real time. For years, Dominic had been his closest strategic ally, the man who negotiated aggressive deals, handled complicated acquisitions, and quietly expanded Vale Technologies into markets Sebastian barely had time to monitor. Sebastian trusted him, completely. Now doubt crept in. Dominic turned sharply toward Clara. You orchestrated this, he said. Clara didn't deny it. I exposed it. Dominic scoffed. Amber, you think a journalist and some spreadsheets can dismantle my career? Clara tilted her head slightly. No. Another pause. You dismantled it yourself. Sebastian exhaled slowly. Something inside him shifted again, because he realized something disturbing. Clara hadn't raised her voice once tonight. Not during the divorce announcement, not during the accusations. She had simply placed evidence on the table and waited. Dominic pointed toward her. You're destroying your husband's company too. Clara's gaze flickered briefly toward Sebastian, then back to Dominic. Only the part you poisoned? The investors murmured louder. One of them whispered to another. If regulators open an investigation, the merger could collapse. Financial stakes just exploded. Sebastian heard it. $4 billion suddenly hung in the balance. Dominic saw that fear appear in Sebastian's eyes. He seized the moment. You see what she's done? Dominic pressed. The deal you worked 2 years to close could vanish overnight. Sebastian's jaw tightened. The investigators remained silent observers, allowing the tension to expose its own truth. Dominic leaned closer to Sebastian. She's turning you into a suspect, too. That sentence landed heavily, because Dominic wasn't wrong. If fraud existed inside Vale Technologies, regulators wouldn't care who signed the checks. They would investigate everyone. Sebastian looked at Clara again. Did you think about that? Clara didn't hesitate. Yes. Sebastian frowned. And you still went public? Clara's answer came softly. When I didn't go public. A pause stretched across the table. Then she added, the truth did. Dominic realized something terrifying. Clara wasn't bluffing, and the world was already watching. Sebastian stepped away from the table. He needed air. The skyline stretched endlessly beyond the rooftop railing, city lights flickering like signals from another world, far removed from the chaos behind him. Clara followed slowly, not close, just enough. You should have told me, Sebastian said quietly. Clara folded her arms. I tried. You mentioned concerns. That was more than a mention. Sebastian rubbed his temples. He remembered that conversation now with painful clarity. 3 months ago, Clara had walked into his office with printed reports and quiet questions about unusual cash flow patterns. Sebastian had barely looked up from his laptop before dismissing the topic. Dominic handles finances. That's what he told her. Trust him. Now that sentence echoed back like a mistake. Sebastian turned toward her. Why didn't you push harder? Clara's expression sharpened slightly. Why would I? The answer caught him off guard. Clara continued calmly. You made it clear my opinion wasn't part of your decision-making process. Sebastian had no response. Behind them, Dominic's raised voice could still be heard arguing with the investigators. Clara glanced back briefly. He's panicking. Sebastian nodded slowly. He shouldn't be. Another pause. If he's innocent. Clara studied him carefully, because that was the first time tonight Sebastian had openly questioned Dominic's integrity. Progress. But it came late. Sebastian leaned on the railing. You worked with that journalist. Yes. How long? 8 weeks. Sebastian turned sharply. 8 weeks? Clara nodded. East Lucas Grant followed the money trail. Sebastian stared out at the city again. 8 weeks. That meant Clara started investigating before the merger negotiations even finished. She had seen something he didn't, or refused to see. Sebastian exhaled slowly. You could have ruined everything. Clara looked at him steadily. Or saved it. Sebastian didn't answer, because he still wasn't sure which one she had done. Behind them, the investigators finally placed a hand on Dominic's shoulder. Dominic's voice rose sharply. Clara watched quietly. The night was reaching another turning point, and the next move wouldn't belong to her. It would belong to Sebastian. Dominic's voice cut through the rooftop. Take your hand off me. The investigator didn't react. It's a request, he replied calmly. Dominic pulled his arm free anyway. Guests stepped further away now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Wealthy people understood risk instinctively, and tonight Dominic Reed had become the most dangerous person in the room. Sebastian returned from the railing. What's happening? Dominic pointed immediately. This is harassment. One investigator held up a tablet. Mr. Reed, these transaction records match the ones published in Lucas Grant's report. Dominic's confidence cracked again. Coincidences happen. The investigator scrolled. Several of these transfers originated from accounts you personally authorized. Sebastian felt something cold settle in his chest. Dominic turned to him desperately. You know how complicated our corporate structures are. Sebastian didn't answer. Dominic pushed harder. You approved the merger framework I designed. That's not the question. Dominic froze, because Sebastian's voice had changed. Calm, but colder than before. Sebastian stepped closer. The question is whether you move company money without my knowledge. Dominic swallowed. That's an accusation. Sebastian held up the documents Clara had given him. It's a pattern. The investors around them listened carefully. Power dynamics were shifting. Dominic realized he was losing the room. He turned sharply toward Clara again. You've manipulated him. Clara's reply came instantly. No. A pause. I revealed you. Dominic laughed bitterly. Yara, you think this ends well for you? Clara met his gaze calmly. I'm not afraid of the truth. That sentence landed harder than expected because Dominic suddenly realized something. Clara had nothing left to lose. Sebastian, on the other hand, had everything, and that made her the most unpredictable person at the table. The investigator stepped forward again. Mr. Reed, we're requesting that you accompany us for further discussion. Dominic hesitated. The rooftop lights reflected off the city skyline behind him. His empire was collapsing, and the fall had just begun. Dominic's breathing slowed. Too slow. Sebastian noticed immediately. Dominic wasn't panicking anymore. He was thinking. That worried Sebastian more. Dominic straightened his jacket and looked at the investigators calmly. Of course, he said. The sudden cooperation surprised everyone, including Clara. Dominic turned toward Sebastian. I'm happy to clarify everything. Sebastian watched him carefully. Dominic smiled faintly. But I think you should come too. Sebastian frowned. Why? Dominic gestured toward the tablet displaying transaction records. Because some of those approvals passed through your office. The statement landed like a shockwave. Investors whispered louder. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. That's impossible, Dominic shrugged. Corporate processes can be complicated. Clara stepped forward. Anna, that's not true. Dominic turned toward her slowly. Are you sure? Clara hesitated, just briefly. Dominic saw it and smiled wider. Because if investigators follow every signature trail, Sebastian might discover he approved more than he remembers. Sebastian felt anger rising. Careful. Dominic held up his hands. I'm simply pointing out the facts. The investigator looked between them. We'll determine the facts. Dominic nodded politely. Of course. But his eyes shifted toward Clara again, and in that glance something darker appeared. A warning. Clara understood immediately. Dominic wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was preparing to drag Sebastian down with him. Financial stakes skyrocketed again. Sebastian realized it too. His billion-dollar merger, his company, his reputation. Everything now balanced on a knife's edge. Dominic adjusted his cufflinks calmly. If I fall, he said softly, I won't fall alone. The rooftop fell silent again, because suddenly this scandal wasn't just about Dominic Reed. It was about Sebastian Vale, and Clara Whitmore had just stepped into the center of a storm far bigger than she planned. Dominic's final sentence hung in the air like smoke. If I fall, I won't fall alone. No one spoke. The rooftop had become painfully quiet, broken only by distant city traffic and the faint hum of helicopter blades somewhere beyond the skyline. Sebastian stared at Dominic, cold, careful. You're threatening me now? He asked. Dominic shook his head slowly. Not at all. Then he gestured toward the tablet in the investigator's hand. I'm reminding you how corporate approvals work. The investigator scrolled through the records again. Several transfers appeared on the screen. Approval chains, authorization stamps. Sebastian leaned closer. His pulse slowed, because Dominic was partially right. Some of those approvals had passed through his office, but something about them felt wrong. Those signatures aren't direct approvals, Sebastian said quietly. Dominic shrugged. They're executive authorizations. Clara stepped forward. No. Everyone looked at her. Clara pointed at the tablet. Those are automated corporate clearances. The investigator paused. Explain. Clara exhaled slowly. The company's system allows financial approvals under preset executive authority thresholds. Sebastian didn't personally authorize those transfers. Dominic's smile faded slightly. Clara continued. But someone with operational access could trigger them. The investigator looked toward Dominic. Sebastian felt realization forming like a storm cloud in his mind. Dominic had built most of Vale Technologies' internal financial architecture. He designed the automation layers, the approval thresholds, the internal pathways. And which meant, Sebastian spoke quietly, you routed transactions through my authorization chain. Dominic didn't answer immediately. Clara watched his face. That hesitation mattered. Sebastian stepped closer. You built the system. Dominic laughed once. Soft. You signed off on the system. Clara noticed something subtle then. Dominic wasn't denying it anymore. He was shifting blame. Sebastian felt the shift too. The investors were watching, the investigators were recording, and Dominic Reed had just revealed something dangerous without meaning to. Sebastian turned slowly toward Clara. You already knew that. Clara met his gaze. Yes. The room went still again, because suddenly everyone realized something shocking. Clara hadn't just uncovered fraud, she had already solved how it worked. And she had been waiting for Dominic to confirm it himself. Dominic saw the realization spreading, and for the first time tonight, true fear entered his eyes. Dominic stepped back again, but this time the retreat was obvious. You're twisting things, he said quickly. Clara shook her head. No. Another pause. You just explained them. The investors murmured again. Because now the structure of the fraud was becoming clearer. Sebastian's voice dropped. You used the automated system to move funds without triggering executive alerts. Dominic pointed sharply. You approved that system. Sebastian nodded slowly. Yes. Then he added something colder. But you built it. The difference was enormous. One designed the lock. The other trusted it. Dominic realized the shift instantly. His leverage was disappearing. He turned toward the investigators. This is speculation. The investigator held up the tablet. These transfer paths match the system architecture. Dominic clenched his jaw. Clara stepped forward slightly. There's more. Sebastian looked at her. More? Clara reached into her purse again. Another envelope. Sebastian recognized it immediately. He frowned. You came prepared. Clara placed the envelope on the table. I always do. Dominic's eyes widened slightly. What's that? Clara slid the papers toward the investigator. A second set of records. The investigator opened the envelope carefully. Several printed charts appeared. Transaction timestamps, server authentication logs, and one final detail highlighted clearly. Dominic Reed's internal login credentials, used during every unauthorized transfer. Dominic felt his stomach drop. No, he said. That's fabricated. Clara shook her head slowly. The server logs came directly from Vale Technologies. Sebastian stared at Dominic. His voice turned dangerously quiet. You logged in during every transfer. Dominic's breathing became shallow. The trap was closing. Financial stakes had become criminal stakes. Sebastian felt something else rising beneath the anger. Betrayal. Years of trust suddenly collapsing under the weight of evidence. Dominic realized it too. He looked around the rooftop. No allies left, just witnesses. And Clara Whitmore standing calmly in the center of it all. The investigator closed the folder. Mr. Reed, he said quietly, you'll need to come with us. Dominic didn't argue this time. He simply stared at Clara and understood something too late. She had been 3 moves ahead all night. Dominic finally exhaled. The fight drained out of him slowly. Fine, he muttered. The investigators stepped closer. One gestured toward the elevator. Dominic didn't move yet. Instead, he turned toward Sebastian one last time. You really think she did this to help you? Sebastian didn't answer. Dominic looked at Clara. You destroyed him tonight. Clara's expression stayed calm. No. Another pause. You did. Dominic laughed quietly. You're naive. He leaned slightly closer. The board will tear Vale Technologies apart once regulators step in. Sebastian spoke for the first time. We'll survive. Dominic shook his head. Not without me. Sebastian's eyes hardened. We'll find out. The investigators finally guided Dominic toward the elevator. Guests parted to clear the path. Phones lifted again, recording everything. Dominic stopped just before the elevator doors. He turned once more, his gaze locked onto Clara. "You're proud of this?" Clara didn't flinch. "I'm honest about it." Dominic studied her face carefully. Then he smiled, but the smile carried bitterness. "You're smarter than he deserved." Sebastian didn't react. Dominic continued, "But power hates embarrassment." The elevator doors opened. Dominic stepped inside. Just before they closed, he spoke one last sentence. "This story isn't finished." Then the doors slid shut. The rooftop remained silent, because everyone felt it. The scandal had only begun. The rooftop slowly emptied. Investors whispered urgently into their phones while leaving the restaurant, already calculating how the scandal might affect markets by morning. The celebration dinner had transformed into damage control. Sebastian remained at the table, silent. Clara watched him carefully, the city lights reflected in the untouched champagne glasses between them. Finally he spoke. "You could have warned me." Clara folded her hands. "I tried." Sebastian nodded faintly. "I know." A long silence followed. The orchestra had packed up. The waiters cleared empty plates quietly. The entire rooftop suddenly felt enormous. Sebastian looked at Clara again. "Why tonight?" Clara answered without hesitation. "Because tonight everyone who matters was watching." Sebastian understood. Public truth carried more power than private accusations. He leaned back in his chair slowly. "You embarrassed me." Clara met his gaze. "You dismissed me." Another pause stretched between them. Sebastian looked out toward the skyline. The empire he built suddenly felt fragile. "I underestimated you," he admitted. Clara said nothing. Sebastian turned back. "Was any of this about saving me?" Clara stood slowly. Her chair slid softly across the marble floor. "No." The word landed like final judgment. Sebastian felt it. Clara picked up her purse. "This was about saving myself." Sebastian watched her walk away from the table. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. Clara stepped into the elevator lobby. The noise from the rooftop faded behind her. For the first time that night, silence. She exhaled slowly. Footsteps approached from the hallway. "Clara Whitmore?" She turned. Lucas Grant stood there holding a phone and small recording device. The journalist looked both impressed and slightly stunned. "That was extraordinary," he said. Clara smiled faintly. "You published quickly." Lucas lifted his phone. "Your documents were solid." He hesitated, then asked the question everyone else would soon ask. "Now that you've exposed one of the biggest corporate fraud schemes in tech," he paused. "What happens next?" Clara looked toward the elevator doors. Her reflection stared back in the polished metal. For years, she had been known as Sebastian Vale's wife. Tonight, that identity ended. She turned back toward Lucas. A quiet smile appeared. "I build something of my own." The elevator doors opened. Lucas watched her step inside. As the doors closed, his phone buzzed again. Another headline notification appeared. "Billionaire divorce scandal rocks tech industry." Lucas looked back toward the rooftop above. The story would dominate global news by morning, but he suspected something bigger. Clara Whitmore wasn't just leaving a marriage. She was beginning a new empire, and the world hadn't seen it coming. Before you go, make sure you subscribe, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this keep unfolding, and the next one might surprise you even more. Stay connected. The elevator descended quietly. And Clara Whitmore finally walked away from the billionaire world that once tried to silence her. But now, everyone was listening.